you from beautiful Florida. And today our question comes to us from Stephen. And Stephen has two questions. One of them is an old question from last year, and the other is a new question, but they dovetail nicely, so I thought that I would take them together. The new question is this: how accurately does mythology portray the character of a given god or goddess? And the older question is, what is a god? So let's see, we have a 5-minute vlog. Yeah, I can answer the question of what is a god very easily in 5 minutes, of course. So let's start there, and then we'll continue on to the question on mythology. What is a god? First, I have to tell you that not everyone would agree with my particular answer to this question, but I'm the one who's being asked, so it's my answer you're going to get. It's worth bearing in mind that the term god is used in different ways, in different connotations, and certainly within paganism. And there is, for example, the very famous Roman essay on all of the gods involved in the building of a door, who had to be propitiated: the god of the door itself, the god of the hinge, the god of the door frame, the god of the threshold, and so forth. But these are obviously very little gods, and in modern terms we'd probably use the term spirit to describe them. But in a lot of ways these terms are interchangeable in a pagan context, and if you pay attention to the vlog, you'll notice that I often refer to deity in a broad and neutral sense as spirit, and also to psychic energy as spirit, and use that term very broadly. And the term god or gods can be used very broadly as well, depending on the context and the speaker. But we're going to use it more narrowly now in the way that most people would expect it to be used for what might be called the major deities. And what is a god? If you're asking me, a god is a way of interacting with the cosmic forces of the universe, the divine forces which create and sustain the universe, which are much larger than ourselves, and which I would say we can never completely comprehend because they are so much larger than ourselves. But to understand them better, we give them familiar forms and ways that we can relate to them emotionally. But we're very foolish, I think, if we assume that those forms encapsulate those powers. They merely describe them and help us to approach them, but they are in fact much larger. And I would say that the gods are basically a human creation as a way of interacting with the very real powers of the universe, which are not nearly as anthropomorphic as our image of them. And what I would say is that if you study the soul, you will see that it's much larger than your conscious mind, and how could a deity be less? And I have a philosophy regarding the word deity or God used in this way, which is that it can never be less than I am myself. It must be something greater. And if I can do it, then a deity must also be able to do it. Yet I've met people who think of deities in such limited terms that they cannot do things that ordinary humans have no trouble doing, and I find that very odd. I think people have a tendency to put their gods in boxes, but often very small boxes. And what I would say is that from a Corellian point of view, when we talk about the gods, the deities, the powers that be, we're not thinking of it in the same terms as a D&D role-playing game. We're thinking of it in much broader, more philosophical terms, though we may anthropomorphize our ideas of deity in more narrow ways so that we can understand it better, but we understand that deity is beyond our full comprehension. And I think that there are certainly people out there who would totally disagree and insist that deities have a very limited range of expression, but I don't think this is actually borne out. I think we are shortchanging ourselves and shortchanging our deities when we put them in narrow little boxes. So on to that second question, how accurately does mythology portray the character of a given deity? I don't even think it's really a relevant question, except in terms of how you interact with them. When we talk about deities, we're talking about cosmic forces which are much larger than people. And yes, those personalities may portray aspects of those deities which are important, but it's not the same as a D&D game. And I'll give you an example, and that's Zeus and all of his mistresses. Do you know why those myths exist? In most cases, they were purely political. They had to do with the worship of local deities, local goddesses, who needed to be syncretized to the expanding following of Zeus. And since they could not be portrayed as his wives, because there was Hera, they were portrayed as mistresses. And the various different myths had different specific details, which had everything to do with how the wider following of Zeus interacted with that particular local area. But in that local area, those various seemingly unimportant mistress figures were very important goddesses, and they were being syncretized to a wider movement. It doesn't necessarily have anything to do with personality. It has to do, in this case, with politics. Mythology also often has to do with explaining the natural processes of the universe, the nature of the soul, of life and death and rebirth, and all of these things, which are put into very human and anthropomorphic terms, but are not truly anthropomorphic things. And I think when you lose sight of that, you can get some very odd ideas, in my opinion. So what I would say is that in interacting with a deity, it can be as narrow or as broad as you are willing to accept it. And how accurate that mythology will be is largely how accurate you force it to be. And I'll give you another example. This has to do with the Corellian ancestors, and I've given it many times before, but I'll give it one more time. When I was young, and we brought through the messages of the ancestors, they were always very serious, very august, very dignified. And this was how it was. It's how we perceived them, it's how we understood them. Lady Bitterwind, when she came to the tradition, found this very odd because she had heard all the stories of the ancestors, and the way she put it, well, they were a bunch of rounders. Why are they so humorless now? These people lived very exciting, interesting lives, and obviously had a sense of humor then. Why is it gone now? And she said, you're censoring them. And we thought about this for a while, and we went to the ancestors and we asked them, are we censoring you? And they said, literally they said, well, duh. And from that moment on, the ancestors communicated with a great deal of humor that we had never permitted them to express before. And that was because we were putting walls on that communication. It wasn't that they were putting those walls, it's that we were. And interacting with deities is the same way. You can make it as narrow as you insist on it being, but it can be very broad, and deities, any deities, can take a great many different forms according to the need. So, this would be my answer. Some people will like it more than others, and that really doesn't bother me. And I hope you find it helpful, and until next time, may you blessed be. Please join me for our Corellian Peace Prayer. I pray for peace. I pray for love. I pray for stability. I pray for the nation where I live. I pray for the world.